Oh, we do. Who is it? You're going to have to help me. Sarah Oldfield. Oh, really? Where is Sarah?
Oh, hi.
Hi, Sarah. Nice to meet you.
Nice.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm not the regular teacher here, so
Okay.
he won't be back for another 6 weeks. But you'll get hopefully a good taste of what goes on here in Discovery anyway.
Okay.
Yes, and if you want to, you can go back, I think we have it on. Do we have old classes?
I think they're on YouTube. Yeah, you can go back and investigate. Because we do live stream this service. Hi, everybody who's joining us via live stream. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. As you may know, your fearless leader, our fearless leader, left on sabbatical yesterday. So I have no idea where he is, and I think that's probably on purpose. He's gonna be, I know where he is. He's in Wales. I don't know if he's on his way, if he's arrived. He hasn't been communicating with me in that respect, unfortunately, nor does he have to. But starting tomorrow morning, and also right now, but only for this hour, I am taking Mark's place, which is a really challenging thing to do. If anything comes up the rest of Sunday, call Ryan, because Ryan is doing everything else. And there's a reason for that. I won't bog down in the details. But starting on Monday, anything that you would have normally called Mark for, you can feel free to call me for. I will do my best. I am really intimidated, y'all. I have like a 5-page single-spaced document of all the things I have to do this week. And it's a little overwhelming. And my wife is 8.5 months pregnant. And there's, so if the baby comes this week, disregard everything that I've said.
All bets are off.
All bets are off. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, to get us started this morning, I just wanted to raise one announcement, which I'm sure most of you already know about, but the Youth Spaghetti Supper Silent Auction Bake Sale, you probably walked right past the bake sale on your way in. Hopefully you bought some delicious goodies. All that is going on today. In fact, I wasn't here last year, but I believe this is correct. If you want lunch early, you can actually go down after this. If you've already been to church, you don't have to wait until the end of the 11 o'clock service. You can go down and get an early lunch starting at 11 o'clock. There's lots of really cool items up for bid, including a dinner evening with the residents that Jared is going to cook for, I think. And Jared, by the way, is a master baker. I feel like every time we have him over to our house, he brings something new, and it's always phenomenal. He made these chocolate chip cookies this week that are literally the best chocolate chip cookies I've ever had in my life. And he puts that really fancy Jared Jagger.
Jared, okay.
You know that really fancy Malden's sea salt that's like diamond crystal things? He put those on top of the cookies, and they will change your life.
Tell him he needs to bring the class some next week.
I have set the bar kind of high. So that's the big thing for Sunday. Does anybody have any other announcements that we need to be aware of? Okay, good. Well, then we'll go ahead and jump into our lesson this morning. So, if Mark communicated correctly with me, which I hope that he did, given that communicating with people is a big part of his job, we're working our way through everything that Jesus ever said.
It's a 10-year study.
It's going to be going on forever. But if I have my notes right, today we are going to be in John chapter 4. I'm going to get it right. Verses 43 through 54.
Yeah, well, we have a big controversy over whether it's a parable or just a story like it was last week.
No.
No. Hey, okay.
Unless you want to, in which case feel free to engage in that debate. So to get us started, with somebody who has a Bible with them, either physically or digitally, just read John 4, 43 through 54. Let's take the first volunteer who pops up.
Oh, I've got one. 43 through 54.
43 through 54.
Okay. After the 2 days, he left for Galilee. Now, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they also had been there. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. The royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus replied, you may go, your son will live. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on his way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time his son got better, they said to him, the fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour. Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. So he and all his household believed. Did you want me to do 54?
Yes,
I'm
please.
sorry.
Did
I apologize. This was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee.
Thanks, Tony.
Sure.
All right, so just to get us going, what did you notice in that story? Did anything stand out to you, surprise you, disturb you, resonate with you? Fill in the verb of your choice. Yeah, Joni?
I don't remember Jesus saying, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you'll never believe.
Yeah, Jesus is
That
a
seemed a
snarky in
little
this
sarcastic.
passage, right? Yeah. And it also seems in some ways to contradict the very next thing that he does, which is perform a sign/wonder for this man. So yeah, that's a good eye there. Anybody else notice anything in this passage?
That one expression, a prophet is without honor, that's just kind of been used.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if a lot of people even realize it came from the Bible. It's just kind of a common little saying.
Yeah, that phrase that John sort of inserts as an editor, a prophet is without honor in his own hometown, has kind of passed into our own modern vernacular, right? It's often something we say when we go home and we don't feel like we fit in, or something like that. But it comes from Jesus' story, and in fact, in every one of the Gospels, there's an experience where Jesus is rejected by people who he sort of believes to be, his home folk. What's interesting is that in the Gospel of John, John sort of reverses the order that we would expect. So remember, Jesus is from Bethlehem, grows up in Nazareth. He's from the northern part of Israel that we refer to as the Galilee. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when he goes home to Nazareth and preaches in the synagogue, he has this experience of being rejected by the congregation there, and that's when he says, a prophet is not without honor in his hometown. But here in John, he leaves Judea, he leaves Jerusalem, and it's as he's leaving Jerusalem that John inserts this comment, a prophet is not without honor in his own place. And he goes to Galilee, and it's in Galilee, actually, that he's received by people. There are all these miraculous signs that are going to happen. We're back in Cana, where he did the water into wine, and it's in Galilee that people believe him. And this is an important thing for us to note, because remember that John sort of stands in its own tradition. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similarities between them because we think they use a lot of the same kind of source material. John is off kind of doing his own thing. And one of the things that John does that's important for us to notice is that John sort of ties Jesus much more closely to Jerusalem and Judea, which is the region around Jerusalem. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus goes to Jerusalem once to die. In Luke, he goes twice. Once as a boy with his parents, 3 times. Twice as a boy, once as an infant, once as a boy, and then once to die as an adult. In the Gospel of John, it feels like he goes down to Judea every other weekend. He goes at least 4 times down to Judea for all kinds of festivals, including Hanukkah. Jesus celebrates Hanukkah in the Gospel of John. He doesn't do that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is interesting. Yeah, it's this fun little detail. And so there are a lot of people who make the argument that John maybe comes from Jerusalem or is connected to Jerusalem and kind of wants to pull Jesus away from this part of the country that was considered kind of backwards. You know, the Galilee was kind of the hill country, or and I don't mean that from a Texas standpoint. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus in that regard. I mean, it is literally hilly, was often referred to as the hill country, and is, from the perspective of the wealthy, sort of educated elite in Jerusalem, kind of, you know, this backwoods part where your redneck uncles and, you know, because everybody's got at least one. That's the Galilee. And so there's some people who kind of argue that John is trying to sort of pull Jesus out of that orbit and put him a little bit more firmly in the kind of educated elite. But then you also have this interesting reversal where Jesus is rejected by the sort of cosmopolitan educated elite and is embraced by the people in the Galilee, by these people who are stereotyped as simple or backwards or country or whatever. And so whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's rejected in the Galilee. In John, he's received there. And it's in the Galilee that this story unfolds. So, does this story remind you of any other stories, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Anybody? Yeah, Jim.
This is the healing of the nobleman's son, is that it?
Mm.
Okay, so
Yes,
isn't that similar to my child has died and or my brother, what was it? Lazarus?
It's similar to Lazarus in some respects in that it's a sort of story of healing or resurrection, and there is something communicated to Jesus over a distance. So Jesus, when Lazarus dies, which is going to be later on in the Gospel of John, Jesus is kind of in the area around Jerusalem, and Mary and Martha live on the other side of the Jordan River in Bethany, and they send word to Jesus that Lazarus is dying. But this actually more closely resembles another couple of stories. There's a really famous and kind of troubling story about Jesus going up into Tyre and Sidon, and he meets a woman who asks Jesus to heal her daughter. Is this starting to ring some bells? I see some heads nodding. Yeah, Caroline?
Would you throw crumbs to the dogs?
Yeah, exactly. So in Matthew and Mark, Jesus goes on a trip up into Tyre and Sidon, which is modern-day Lebanon, and while he's there, he meets a woman who is identified in Matthew as a Canaanite and in Mark as a Syrophoenician, that is not Jewish, definitely not Jewish, and she asks him to heal her daughter, and she gets into this argument with him. Jesus says to her, my purpose is to come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's not right to give the food from the children's table to the dogs, clearly sort of implying that she is of some kind of lower, less important class. And then she pushes back against him, and she says, but even the dogs get to lick up the crumbs that fall off the children's table. And you get this sense that he's surprised and delighted by this pushback, and so he says, go, your faith has made your daughter well. And so from a distance, without ever seeing her, he heals this woman's daughter. And he also does this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke for a centurion's son or servant. You can translate it either way. And it's interesting because in John, Jesus is when he does miracles, he gets his hands dirty. He spits, and he makes mud, and he touches people. And it's a little awkward, if I'm being completely honest. People get healed in the end, but there is this intermediate step of spit and mud and all this interesting stuff. Jesus is down in the dirt, sort of. But here, in this story, he heals at a great distance. So, he's come back from Judea into the Galilee, and he's gone to Cana, which is where the very first miracle in the Gospel of John happens, which is water into wine, exactly. So this is a part of the part of where Jesus grew up. And he's in Cana, and when he's in Cana, this royal official comes to him, and says, "My son is ill," who is in Capernaum, by the way, which is, depending on how you go, between 12 and 20 miles away. And instead of making the trip out there to Capernaum, it's while Jesus is still in Cana that he heals this royal official's sick child. Which is a pretty incredible feat, right? I mean, most of the things that Jesus does are incredible, but there's something even more incredible about not having to go there or touch the child or see the child or know anything about this child. And Jesus effects this healing miracle at a great distance. Which suggests what? What do you think John is trying to convey to us about Jesus by having Jesus do something like this?
That he's omnipotent. Sorry, Mike.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say that he's omnipotent. He doesn't
Yeah,
have
that
to
he
be
is
there.
truly the Son of God.
Yeah.
I read an article one time that Billy Graham said that any time that he has an individual, this is a long time ago, that is searching for his faith, he tells them to go read the book of John. Because the book of John explains Christ, brings him, and helps the individual to understand that this is the Son of God.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an act of incredible power, you know, and it's also an unmistakably divine thing. If Jesus goes in person to Capernaum and heals the child, most people could see that as a miracle, but some people could still say, he knows something about medicine or healing, and it was done naturally. But for Jesus to do this at a distance, 20 miles away, this is unmistakably an act of divine power. This is something that a normal person cannot or should not be able to do, and it suggests from the beginning of this story that there's something different about Jesus, and we'll get to exactly what is different when we get to the end of the story. Let's see.
Aaron, is this in the other Gospels, this story, is it in the other Gospels as well?
This particular story is unique to the Gospel of John, but it is very similar, like we said, to the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter and to the healing of the centurion's son. But this particular sort of string of events is unique to John. Let's see, what else might you want to know about this story?
I'm curious.
Yeah, Jim?
It says that he was trying to find out when it happened,
Mhm.
and he says I think it said 1 o'clock or something. I would have thought back then, what would they do? Look at their sundials, or how would they? You know, it's not like we look at our watch.
Yeah.
How were they able? Were they that on top of time back then?
That's a great question. I mean, you're right. They didn't exactly have, wrist-mounted sundials like you see in the Flintstones. Because,
I bet they had Timex.
those things will just always work. Always work. So, you tell time, it's relative to the position of the sun. And it's important enough that most communities have somebody, like a town crier. If you've ever been to a medieval fair, there's somebody who rings a bell and says, 1 in the afternoon, and they kind of would have had people like that. And so it's not an exact science in the way that we think of, our clocks, which are accurate to the amount of time it takes an atom to decay from a cesium-14 ion in the... I'm just making that up. An atomic clock is relative to atoms.
You could have fooled us, we would have believed you.
Too much power. This is dangerous. So it wouldn't have been pinpoint accuracy, but they would have known around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or the 7th hour, as some of your translations might put it. Yeah. So there's enough awareness of the time of day to make these things match up. So, and that's an important detail, actually, so that when the royal official comes home, he doesn't just say, "Oh, well, your kid got better and we don't really know what happened." The people can say, "It happened around 1 o'clock," and he can say, "Well, around 1 o'clock, I was with Jesus." And look at the wrist-mounted sundial. I was with Jesus. Jesus said this around 1 o'clock, and if they know, and this matches up, and we can see that this is related to Jesus's his words rather than anything else. So it's an important little detail that John throws in. Let's see. There's not enough information in the text for us to really know who this royal official is, or even which royal person he was an official for, which is not disappointing. You know, you always want to know a little bit more about these characters in the Bible that just kind of get named very quickly, and then the story kind of moves on. But for this guy, we don't really know. He could have been an official for King Herod. He could have been a member of the Roman government. There's just not enough evidence given to us. We know that he's somebody who's important, obviously. And he also has this this interesting sense of kind of understanding between him and Jesus. And in fact, in the similar stories, the healing of the centurion's son in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the centurion actually engages in kind of a debate with Jesus, where he says, hey, I understand that you're somebody who has power. Well, I have power too, and when I tell my soldiers to go and do something, they go and do it. And so basically, the centurion says, you and I know what to do with power, and if I can do this with humans, then you who are the Son of God should be able to do even more. So that's kind of missing from John's version of the story, but there's a kind of implied awareness of that this royal official understands how power works, and he wants Jesus to sort of use his power for him. Interestingly, this is the very first healing story in John's Gospel. We're 4 chapters in at this point, and this is the first time that John decides to show a healing story, which is another big difference between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John has these miracles that are miracles in and of themselves, but that also sort of point to larger things beyond the miracle. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem very much content with the miracle itself. And so Jesus is healing people all over the place. Jesus is exorcising demons. He's doing all these things. In John, Jesus is much more kind of selective and focused with his healings. And in fact, this is a particularly interesting detail. In John, Jesus doesn't perform any exorcisms. All over the place in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially in Mark. But in John, there's not a single exorcism. And these healing stories are a little bit more focused, and as we'll see when we get to the end of this story, it is a good thing, it is an undeniably good thing that the royal official's son gets healed, but there's something larger going on here than just simply the healing of the official's son. Come on, Paige.
Didn't they view though exorcism back then, the evils, the devil, weren't they viewed for even down to illnesses? They would.
Yes, absolutely. So that's an excellent point, Jim. Demonic possession, and this is a much longer conversation than we have time for necessarily, was often connected to physical illnesses. And so it's entirely possible that could be John's way of kind of incorporating exorcism into his narrative, is that when Jesus heals somebody, there might be an implied understanding of this is a healing and an exorcism kind of tied together. He never makes it explicit, unfortunately, so we kind of have to, if we're going to go down that route, it's something that we kind of have to assume. But it's an assumption that I think can be made fairly given the sort of understanding of the world that the authors of the Gospels would have brought with them. So that's a good point. So what do we make of this sort of snarky, sarcastic Jesus here in verse 48? Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. I mean, that's kind of... Joni is right. I think Jesus is kind of sarcastic, and it takes us a little off guard, I think. What do you make of this?
Don't you think that it's still happening today? I mean, there are many among us in Christendom that we, like pushing people over and all kinds of divine healing, televangelism that incorporates miracles, and a lot of people really tune into that.
Yeah.
And isn't that about the same thing as these people of his day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
plug it into signs and miracles, or they won't believe.
I definitely think there's a resonance between those things, absolutely. That there's a sort of innate human desire to have proof, to know for sure, and that something like a divine healing absolutely would validate that, yeah. I saw some other hands, Shannon?
Well, is it snarky, or is he just calling a spade a spade?
Right.
That's a fair question,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Call it
Because
and see it.
Because he didn't ask, hey, I'm not going to believe unless you do something, unless you save them. Jesus just said, I know you, and you're not going to unless I do something.
Actually, he's just acknowledging
Yeah.
human nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And were there not other people around?
Well, and that's an important point too, is most English Bibles will translate the you as you, as a first person singular, but actually, or second person singular, but it's actually a second person plural. So, Joni, your Bible got it right when it said you people. Here in Texas, we might more colloquially translate it as y'all. So Jesus isn't responding directly to the royal official. He's responding to what must have been a crowd that had gathered around them that was kind of eagerly waiting for this. So in some respects, it's not really about the motivations of the official, which seem to be pure. My son is dying. I need help. You are the only person who can help me. Do this, please.
I think that's pretty fair for your kids.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the purest motivations you can possibly have. But I think, Jim, you're right. He intuits that there's something else in the crowd that seems to say, okay, our belief in this moment is hinging upon whether or not he does this thing. And what's interesting is, even though he says this, it doesn't stop him from performing a sign or a wonder. But it doesn't necessarily unfold the way people might have expected. You know, there are lots of other accounts from around the time of Jesus of people performing healings and exorcisms and miracles, and they tend to be, this is going to sound derogative, I don't mean for it to be derogative, but they tend to be very flashy. There's a particular rabbi that I'm thinking of whose name was Honi the Circle Drawer. Because part of what he would do would literally, to perform miracles, would draw circles in the dust and then kind of dance and chant around them. And which is not to say that that was in any way an inauthentic expression of his faith, because the Jewish sources who write about Honi make it very clear that they believe that he was able to perform miracles. But there's a sense in which there is kind of an obviousness. We expect miracles to be big and bright and flashy. I mean, people falling down and speaking in tongues and all of these things. But this miracle that Jesus performs, I mean, it's important and it's world-shattering in some ways, but it's also very subtle. It's not, I'm going to show up and put my hand on you and push you over and do all these things, but rather, it's a word. Go.
Well, also,
She's healed.
you say that it's about, it could be 12 to 20 miles distance. They didn't have the same kind of communication we do.
Right.
And so to have those folks over there to verify this is not a simple thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so,
Absolutely.
And so, did the official walk 20 miles just to see Jesus?
It seemed, well, that's a good question.
Or just happened to be?
He may have just happened to have been there. There are a number of times in the Gospels, though, when Jesus comes to a region and his fame is so great that people make the journey just to see him. So John doesn't make it clear, but either scenario is possible. Either he just so happened to be in Cana that day on some other kind of official business, or he made the trek specifically to see Jesus. Whatever happens in the beginning, he definitely makes the trek back home to check in on his child, and that's when he discovers that the miracle is happening.
Isn't that funny too, though, that, you know, when you see all the passion plays, you know, and the music's running and they're all, you know, he's reaching out and people are being healed.
Yeah.
In this case, he's healing from a distance.
Yeah.
People aren't around to see that anything actually happened. It's somewhere else, so it's not like everyone's going, wow, I'm amazed. Well,
Yeah.
amazed they don't know.
Yeah, exactly. There is a different quality to this miracle. And like I said, when we get to the very end, when John kind of adds his editorial comment about this being a sign, we'll be able to see a little bit more clearly what John potentially intends all of this to mean. So, Jesus kind of makes this comment, and then the official pushes back. And this is a common theme, remember, in these distance healings. The centurion will sort of say, actually, I know how power works. Will you help me with this? And the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman pushes back and says what she says. And the official doesn't even really dignify Jesus' sort of comment with a response. He simply says, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." And this is a theme in all of these distance healing stories, that as soon as the person kind of pushes back or sort of redirects the energy, Jesus says, "Go. Your faith," he says, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and returned on his way. And by the way, you probably already know this, but when John uses the word live or life, he's always making a pun. This is a double entendre. So the boy will live literally means the boy will be healed. But actually, somebody read John 10:10 for me real quick. Somebody who can flip there. Somebody who is good at sword drills.
Charge.
Would you say 10?
John 10:10.
Maybe, hold on. Pregnancy eyesight's a real thing, or lack thereof. Okay. The thief, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
This is what Jesus is about in the Gospel of John. Life in Greek, by the way, there are two words that describe life. One of them is the word bios, from which we get biology, which kind of describes the condition of life. You either are alive or you are not alive. Bios. The second word, which is the word that John uses in 10:10 and also here in our passage today, is the Greek word zoe, which is now passed into popular usage as a girl's name, Zoe. But it's about a quality of life. It is about, for Jesus, it is about experiencing life in the kingdom of God in the age that is to come here in this present moment. It is what we mean when we talk about being saved. It is about an experience of God that has the quality of heaven or the age to come, but that happens here in the present moment. And so when Jesus says to the official, "Your son will live," he uses the word zoe. So he's saying your son will be healed, but also as a part of this healing, your son will experience this very thing that I have come into the world to do. And in fact, as a result of this healing, many people will experience this, because when the royal official gets home and he discovers that his son has been healed, it's not just him and his son that share this moment of belief. The whole household comes to believe in Jesus as a result of his healing. And that life that Jesus has promised spreads not only from this boy, or goes into this boy and heals him, but it spreads into the entire household. Which is what happens when Jesus shows up. Sorry, Jim?
How do you define household? Just the family,
This is a
the
great
slaves, the what?
Jim, I wish I knew the answer to that. People debate about this all the time. Whether it could mean simply genetic relatives. It could mean everybody in the household, including slaves and servants. It could mean something in between. We don't know for sure, and John unfortunately doesn't really clarify this. But it happens a lot. It happens in John, it happens in Acts. Whole households are converted because of one person's experience of Jesus, and then them bringing that back to their household. So even if we only understand it as the biological family, though, we should probably understand that as a large group of people, because people didn't fully understand contraception, and infant mortality rates were high, so people had lots and lots of children. And so even if it's just a kind of biological household, we're probably thinking at least 6 kids. People in this culture were not afraid to have mistresses or multiple wives. So again, even if it's just the biological household, that can be a large number, especially if you then expand it to include slaves. For somebody who is a royal official, that could be 15, 20 people. So it has a large kind of ripple effect on this whole household. Sorry, Leanna?
An organization.
Yeah.
The direction of this whole unit of society has now been turned
Yeah.
It's this whole unit of society has now turned.
And that's a really important point for you to draw out, because in Greco-Roman society, which had largely influenced Jewish society at this point, by the way, so on some level it doesn't matter if he's Gentile or Jewish, the family is kind of a microcosm of the state. So the state is supposed to be run like a family. That's why the emperor is kind of referred to as the father of the nation, and the country is often referred to as like a fatherland or something like that. And vice versa. So the family has a responsibility to kind of function like a small state and reinforce the teachings of the state. That's why the father, acting like the emperor, has all the power that he has in the household. So when one household converts, it's almost like a cog in the imperial machine has been jammed in some way. And that this sort of mini state that was supposed to be supporting the Roman machine is now no longer supporting the Roman machine. It's supporting Jesus and Jesus' project of life. And so this whole household flipping thing is really important. Sometimes it can just seem like a quick way for John to say, oh, and then a bunch of people, came down the aisle at the Billy Graham Crusade and they signed the cards and went on about their ways. This is John saying society is beginning to be turned upside down as a result of what Jesus is doing. And it's a really, really important thing to notice. Thanks for bringing that out, Leanna. Another interesting point, another interesting thing to note is that when Jesus says this, the official doesn't ask for any proof. He doesn't ask for any additional signs. He simply says, okay, I believe you, and then he's off home. Now, you could make the argument that going home to check on the son is a kind of testing, but I think you can also make the argument that that's a very natural parental instinct. Somebody says your child has recovered, you want to go home and see for yourself, and know, and love on that child, and sort of receive them back to health yourself. And that's what he does. He makes the 20 or so mile trek back to Capernaum to check on his son, and that's where he has the exchange that we talked about earlier about when did this happen. Oh, it happened right around the time that Jesus said it would happen, and the son is healed. And then we get to this last verse, verse 54, which is kind of the key to all of this. This was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. So in the first half of his gospel, John lays out 7 signs that are 7 miracles that are unique to John that are supposed to demonstrate and convince us that Jesus is the Messiah. So the first one we've already talked about is the water to wine. The second one is the healing of this royal official's son. And what John kind of leaves out is all of the stuff that he introduces with the first sign. So think back to John chapter 2. Jesus performs the miracle. The water gets changed into wine. The steward has this moment where he says, oh, you've saved the best wine for last. This is amazing. And what happens? The disciples all get, blasted and everybody forgets about it, right? No. They may have gotten blasted, but what happens later, once everybody has kind of sobered up the next day, is that they see this sign, and it makes them aware of the glory of Jesus. And because they are aware of Jesus' glory, they come to believe. They come to be aware of who he is as the Son of God. They catch just a glimpse of that beautiful prologue that John puts at the beginning, the Word was with God. They get just a tiny little taste of that when they see Jesus turn the water into wine, and it causes them to believe. And that's what's going on here in this story too. The healing of the child, again, is absolutely important for the royal official. His son, probably like most of our children, is kind of our whole world. And it is absolutely vital and important and humane that Jesus performs this miracle for this particular person. And the miracle has the double effect of functioning as a sign that shows us that Jesus is God. Jesus is the one who has the power not only to bring about abundance, which is what the miracle at Cana is about, the abundance of wine, of a good and luxurious thing. He has the power to bring about life. And not just life in the sense of your cells are alive and you're breathing and eating and doing all the things that you need to be biologically alive, but he has the power to bring about the kingdom of God, the age to come, here in this present moment. And that power transforms people's lives and changes things, changes societies, changes the course of empires. And that's what this sign is doing here in John's gospel. Jesus is the life giver. And it is our encounter with Jesus, the life giver, that is then, just like the first sign, supposed to give us a glimpse of Jesus' glory and then cause us, the people reading about this story later on, to believe and to be changed as a result of our encounter here. Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
When you mentioned earlier that this was the gospel that he sort of got his hands dirty in, it made me remember when he stooped down and wrote in the dirt. That was in John too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they said, nowadays they're saying maybe he said, "I love you," or something really powerful like that, but we really don't know.
Yeah,
But I thought that was really cool that you brought that out, because I would have never thought about John being the one, like you said, the spittle.
Right. Yeah, well, because we talk about John as though John is this kind of elevated spiritual book, and in some ways, John is more explicit in the theology that he's doing than Matthew, Mark, and Luke are. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not without theology. John shows his cards a little bit more, shows his work a little bit more. And so we often have this sort of understanding that John is happening up here, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are down here. But really, John is just as much down here. I mean, he starts out up here with the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and with God. But then immediately, before chapter 1 is over, the Word is down here. The Word moved into the neighborhood. Is one way to translate that. Pitched his tent and lived among us. So the Word is here. Jesus is here. And he does. You're absolutely right, Caroline. He draws in the dirt when he has that encounter with the woman who's caught in adultery. He does all of these things with his hands, because this is not a gospel that only exists up here. It's a gospel that exists down here. When Jesus comes, it is good news, not just in an up here kind of way, but in a down here kind of way. And it is exactly stories like this that show us. If all Jesus cares about is punching people's tickets to heaven and getting them in the gate, well, dispatch Billy Graham to go tell the kid to pray the prayer, and then he can pass on and go. But Jesus is concerned about more than that. Jesus is concerned about that, absolutely, but Jesus is also concerned about people's quality of life in the here and now. In this present moment, Jesus wants people to have what is coming in heaven in the age to come here. And that's what this sign is about. It's about showing them that through him, by trusting in him and what he is able to do, they can have access to that. That life that he's promised is available in the present, and it's available just like it is to this kid. Let's see. One of my favorite authors on the topic of the Gospel of John makes a really interesting point here that I think bears repeating before we start moving into prayer requests and all that. She makes the point, and I think this is well worth our consideration, that this man doesn't come to Jesus looking for the things that Jesus is offering. He comes to Jesus because he needs help. He needs physical, material help. As do many, many people. He needs something in his life right now. He needs the health of his child. And you could substitute that for a number of things. He needs a meal in his belly. He needs a warm place to sleep. And he only comes to faith after that need is met.
Is this an example of God meeting you where you're at?
I think so, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a reminder to us, too, that there can be no sort of easy disconnect between physical needs and spiritual needs.
We have to meet that.
That they go hand in hand, and that often meeting one helps meet the other, But to sort of divorce them and say, well, we are, a church, we only meet spiritual needs. There's a place that meets physical needs around the corner. It kind of misses the point. It kind of separates those two things in a way that Jesus never separates. Jesus performs all kinds of healings, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where he never asks the person, well, do you believe now? Did you pray the prayer? There is this sort of sense in Jesus' mind that the physical and the spiritual are so immediately linked that to tend to one automatically tends to the other. That when Jesus performs a healing, that is the same as someone receiving the spiritual gift of salvation. And it's the case in this story too. When the man finds out that his immediate need is met, that his son is healed, it is then that he has the capacity for belief. Now he doesn't sort of stay in this arena of what can Jesus do for me, because that misses the point too. John is very much not interested in giving us a Jesus who is a sort of programmable God machine that we say, well, if I push lever A, I get miracle B, and I know kind of how to manipulate these things. John is very much trying to get us to a place of understanding that Jesus is obviously deeply concerned for our individual needs, but also that Jesus has a cosmic mission that involves the whole world. And what this story is really trying to get us to do on some level is to move from, well, what can Jesus do for me individually, which again is important. Individual needs are important. But the story, like all of the signs in John, are trying to get us to move from what can Jesus do to who is Jesus. And John says, in this story, Jesus is the life giver, the one who brings not just physical life, but this kind of quality of life that is beyond our ability to even comprehend or understand it, but somehow is given to us. Is there a question over here?
I don't know, it was interesting that, he believed before he found out his child was cured.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he went there probably indicated he already had that belief. It wasn't a test to him.
Right. Yes,
It was,
yeah.
Because he believed as soon as Jesus said it was done.
Right. And that's an important distinction, that he believes the moment Jesus says it's done. And then he goes, and at the household, then everybody believes. And these two things are tied up together.
Was there an animosity between the Jews and the Romans? Wasn't there? So he stepped, first of all, the Roman came to him, whole another group of people.
Right.
And then he went ahead and did it for them, even though they're not a Jew.
So this is a complicated question. Yes, there was animosity between some groups, some Jewish groups, and the Romans. There were other Jewish groups who were all about sort of appeasing Rome and being a part of that system. So, yes, there were tensions. The tricky thing is we don't know whether the royal official was Jewish or Roman. So he could have been a part of the Roman imperial machine. He could have also been part of Herod's royal sort of entourage. So, there very well could be an example of Jesus kind of crossing those political and ethnic boundaries here. We just don't know enough about the royal official to be able to say with any certainty. But good question. Anybody else have any kind of final thoughts, questions as we wrap this up? Thank you all for a wonderful conversation, by the way. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. We'll wave goodbye to our friends joining us via live stream. And now I will open it up.
We're so glad that you've joined us in Discovery class via live stream today. And we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.